Welcome to Environmental Law course, dear learner and viewer. Today we are going to discuss about the forest laws and policy in colonial India. Under this lecture, what we are going to discuss that the forest is first law which have drawn the attention of the Britisher and under its perspective of the colonialism, capitalism and imperialism. And forest happens to be the first area which was constructed as the drain of wealth theory, wherein the Britishers were of the firm view that the extraction of the raw materials from India and to give impetus to the industrial revolution in England, it is very necessary that the forest should be identified as one of the major source of revenue. And under the colonial policy, the forest policy, laws and policy is the first attention of the British in this country. The idea was to see that how the objective and the core structure of the act and the critique of the post-independent perspective, definition and classification of the forest produce and the geographical and ecological context of the Indian forest have evolved a very comprehensive forest law in the colonial period, and the first classification and impact of the forest law is seen into 1878 Act, and then we find a radical change in the land and policy integration of 1980. We also find a very important enactment in the colonial India is the Land Acquisition Act of 1894, which have created and claimed the doctrine of eminent domain, and under this doctrine of eminent domain, the colonial master and the Britishers have created a right over the land as to acquisition of the land for any national purposes have for the industrial purposes and the national purposes. It's a different thing that what happens to be the national purposes and what happens to be the guiding factor of the Land Acquisition Act may be questioned, but they got an overarching power of land acquisition for any kind of a development project, including the forest. That's why we see that for the governance of the Indian forest law, what was required and what was necessary to have first the Land Acquisition Act, and that Land Acquisition Act has given enormous power to the colonial master. Therefore, after the land acquisitions enactment, then we have British India's first forest policy in the same year, and that speaks volumes about that how the question of land acquisition and the forest control both are together to be taken by the Britishers in colonial India. And in this context, we see that how 1878 Act and how the land and policy integration is starting from 1890 to 1918, and how the Land Acquisition Act of 1894 vis-a-vis the drafting of the first forest policy of 1894 have given shape and paved the way for the Indian Forest Act of 1927 by consolidation of the colonial forest law into a very comprehensive enactment. And that Indian Forest Act of 1927 is said to be one of the classical piece of the colonial legislation on conservancy and the economic declaration of the forest. Anyone who is expecting that the Forest Act of 1927 was a law which have devoted to the question of the conservation of forests will be a great misnomer. In fact, it was taken as a part of the colonial extraction of the resources of India, and therefore the assessment and impact of British forest policy in the context of 1878 law, Land Acquisition Act of 1894 and Indian Forest Act 1927 vis-a-vis the first policy specification on the India's forest in 1984 is the backgrounder to study what we can say the forest laws and policy in colonial India. With this, we will try to see that how the Indian Forest Act happens to be a very comprehensive law, and the comprehensive character of this law can be gauged from the point of view that this forest law consists of 86 sections, and we require that all the 13 chapters and 86 sections of the Forest Act deserves a clear mention. The preliminary provisions have been engrafted into one section 1 and section 2. Then section 3 to section 27 has devoted to the question of the reserve forest. Section 28 is talking about the village forest. Section 29 to 34 is talking about the protected forest. Section 35 to 38 is designated to control over the non-governmental forest. Section 39 talks about the duty on timber and forest produce. Section 41 talks about the transit and control of the forest produce. Section 45 and 51 talks about the collection of the drift and stranded timber. And section 67 to 69 deals about the penalties and the procedure. Section 70 talks about the cattle trespass. Section 72 to 75 talks about the power, function and role of the forest officers. And section 76 to 86 talks about the subsidiary miscellaneous provisions and rules which has been engrafted into the Forest Act, consisting of 13 chapters and 86 sections. With this, we see that whatever has been the colonial policy of the forest law and policy, we will try to see that what historical legacy is underpinned. Therefore, the salient features of the forest can be understood for the first time that it happens in India, that we have a reserve forest under section 3 to 27, we have a village forest and protected forest. So, the key division and the key partition of the India's forest into the reserve forest, protected forest and the village forest is for the first time has exhibited. And how it has come into being? It has come into being by Land Acquisition Act, which has empowered the Britishers to acquire the land, and once it acquired the land, then it reserved the forest, and it reservation of a particular area under the Land Acquisition Act 1894 and the Forest Policy of 1984 have been a kind of a background exercise to look at that how the reserve forest can be created under section 3 to 27 and protected forest under section 29 to 34 along with the village forest under section 28. Thus, the key administrative power of the Indian Forest Act is pertaining to the nature of the reserve forest, and if we look at the very criteria of management of the reserve forest, then we find that procedure for declaration and notification is given under section 20, judicial interpretation of section 20 and prohibited activities in the reserve forest have been delineated under section 26, and judicial decision on section 26 offenses and settlement of right. In this context, we see that how the 13th chapter and 86th section of the Forest Act truly represent India's historical legal history. It is a very important in a statute in the context of legal history, and as well as try to see the colonial character of the law, having 13 chapter and 86 section, one of the lengthiest enactment on forest law we had. It has rooted into the colonial legacy, crafted to serve the British economic interest of colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. It was enacted primarily to seek revenue generation through large scale extraction of the forest resources, and for that end, to serve the economic interest, what is required was the fact that there must be some revenue generation and large scale extraction of the forest resources. What is required? That there was a need for a powerful forest bureaucracy parallel to civil and the police services in India, and the Indian Forest Service was designated as a separate service by the Britisher, which is still continuing in the independent India. Thus, it resulted into mass dispossession of the forest-dependent community, and that is a kind of a catastrophe which has been done by the slew of the forest policy and laws right from 1878 to 1894 and 1927. Thus, we see that in the last 50 years, from 1878 to 1927. This is the phase that 1878 to 1927 till the enactment of the Forest Act. It resulted dispossession of the forest community from the forest area either in the name of Forest Act 1927 or in the name of the Land Acquisition Act 1894, and there was a complete takeover of the land and the forest area by the British colonial masters to serve the needs of economy, revenue generation, and extraction of the forest resources, at the same time disempowering the people and dispossession of the forest dependent communities. With this, we try to see that how the 1927 Forest Act have been a law which have consolidated all other forest laws, meaning thereby right from 1855 to 1927. This is a long phase, as we have seen in the beginning in the synoptic outline, that from the first classification and impact of the forest was discernible in 1878. So, be that 1878 or be that the Regulating Act of 1855, this is the phase, and this phase is typically almost happens to be the 75 years period, and this 75 years of period has clamped the colonial strategy of extraction of the forest resources. Therefore, right from 1855 to 1927, within the period span of the 75 years, the entire forest laws and policy aligned with the colonial policy, and the control over the forest and land resources have completely shifted to the Britishers, and that was also very effective by reserve forest concept, where the exclusive use by the state only. It declared the forest protected forest, allowing a very limited local use under the state supervision. So one was the state have taken the control, and for the namesake it created the village forest managed by the local community, but it has also the state taking as a whole, be that village forest, be that protected forest, be that the reserve forest, in all the estate has the control, and estate happens to be colonial in character. Therefore, the entire administrative control over the ecological conservation of the forest have passed to the Britishers from 1855 to 1927, completes an era and a phase of colonial hegemony over the forest resources of this country. Then we see that despite the Forest Act, which consists of 68 section and 13 chapter, we find that its comprehensiveness, that the act does not prioritize what we can say about the Forest Act, that 86 sections we peruse and 13 chapter which we have in the Forest Act, taken as a whole, what we can have some generalization about India's forest policy is the fact that despite its comprehensive character, it did not prioritize what is core, that is conservation and sustainability. From both the angle, this policy happens to be very negligible in character. So, the forest being viewed major sector of the revenue and alienation of indigenous people and local community and traditional management have been a kind of a legacy which India herited in the post-independent India in matters of conservation of forests, and that's why the law relating to Forest Conservation Act 1980, the Forest Rights Act of 2006, and the PESA Act of 2013 have been directed to a different direction to seek some of the remedies which and some of the infirmities which have crept into the India's forest policy right from 1855 to 1927. With this, we will try to see some of the broad features of the Forest Act. Section 2, subclause 4 of the Indian Forest Act defines forest produce, and it includes timber, wood, chemicals, charcoal, resin, bark. It also defines non-timber forest produce, which include lac, honey, wax, fruits and flowers. It also talks about animal product, tusk, horn, skins, cocoons, silk, and minor minerals such as peat, surface oil, rock, and mineral. Thus, it classified in three broad categories. The definition which has been given in the forest produce can further be easily be summarized either under the category of timber, non-timber, and minor mineral. So, this is the canvas and the ambit of the definition of the forest which has been given under Section 2(4) of the Indian Forest Act. Then we see that India's forest diversity varies across physiographic zones. It contains western and eastern Himalayas, it contains north and eastern plain, it contains central highland, it contains northeast and south Deccan, it contains western and eastern Ghat, it contains coastal regions, west and east. Thus, we see that the agroclimatic conditions and the varied and diverse conditions in India has given rise to different kind of physiographic zones, and this is very distinct in growing stock of the biodiversity, and as well as it has a greater impact on sustainable forest governance model. But we see that despite its dividend on the geographic and ecological diversity in reference to six categories of the geographical spread of the forest zone, we see that this evolution of the forest law have devolved under the Charter of 1857. That's 1855. That's why we always talk that right from 1855 to 1927 is the classical period of the colonial hegemony of the forest law. First manual of the forest operation was drafted, codified in 1863. Indian Forest Act, the precursor of 1927 Act, was passed in 1865. So legally speaking, we can say that the starting of the forest law started in 1865 and culminated in 1927. But if you look at the charter as a piece of legislation and as a piece of legal guidance, then it is 1855 and 1865. So there is a difference of the 10 years. But we see that even before the mutiny of 1857, and as we see that we have an 1860 IPC law in the backdrop of the mutiny. So prior to the mutiny or the revolt of 1857, the Britisher have started devoting its attention to the revenue generation under the forest law by the Charter of 1855, drafting a manual of the forest operation, having an Indian Forest Act of 1865. Then it was replaced by 1878 Act. Then it was again, we see that finally we see that the entire category and categorization of the reserve forest, protected forest, village forest is being envisioned even in the Indian Forest Act of 1872, and that categorization is having now more than 150 years, and that is still continuing in India. So that was for the first time done by the Indian Forest Act of 1872, and this enfranchisement or disempowerment of the forest dependent community started right from 1865, and we see that how the traditional communal forest management transformed into a kind of a state monopoly and the colonial hegemony. After enactment of the Forest Act of 1878, we find a land and policy integration into 1890 to 1918 phase. Because 1890 is important because prior to the Land Acquisition Act 1894, this kind of a policy was considered to be necessary, and the land and policy integration question came in 1890, 1891, 1901, 1911, and 1918, and it has strengthened the entire administrative control under in a sledgehammer manner under the Land Acquisition Act of 1894, and thus the extensive forest survey and mapping by the Survey of India was done in 1910 after the Land Acquisition Act of 18 1894. The Land Acquisition Act was based on the doctrine of eminent domain, and it has allowed a state to acquire land for public purposes. And defining the public purposes is something very vague, but for any kind of the public purposes which the colonial master considered and deemed necessary has defined, and by that definition bringing into for the public purposes under the Land Acquisition Act, it has acquired the major chunk of land and the forest area under its cover and applied the doctrine of eminent domain. Thus, the legislative foundation for expanding state control over the forest land, which started from 1855 to 1865, 1878, and it was culminated under Land Acquisition Act of 1894 by the slew of land and policy integration policy during the last 20 years period 90 to 1918, and thus we see that it serves the more concrete legal foundation for the India's colonial law, forest laws and policy. After that, we see the Land Acquisition Act, which have enacted and applied the eminent domain doctrine. It is modeled on the American eminent domain law, and it was slightly given a English compensation law. Here it remains to be said that one, the Land Acquisition Act 1894, any land under the eminent domain doctrine of the American eminent domain law was taken over. Then there was there is two things. The one is the extinguishment of the right. So all the community which were having some rights over the land, their rights are extinguished in a very summary manner with certain compensation law to be paid to them. A token compensation is to be paid, but once the land is acquired on for very public purposes, then any community who were having the land on over that right over that land happens to extinguish their right in one stroke. Thus, this parent act become Indian Land Acquisition and Compensation Law, and there are two guiding principles. One is the right of expropriated owner to receive only compensation, and the second thing, the acquisition allowed for public purposes. So, some paltry sum of money was paid as by way of compensation, and for public purposes it has acquired for roadways, for railways, for stations, and it extended to utilities, public utility services, and it also extended to private undertaking. So there is a wholesale acquisition of the land for dam, irrigation, and as well as the Indian industrial purposes. So we see the Land Acquisition Act 1894 has to be seen as one of the prominent development oriented law, and this law has laid the legal foundation for all forest control measures influencing the national forest policy of 1894, because as we have seen that the land acquisition policy and as well as uh, the we see that first forest policy 1984 and then the Land Acquisition Act of 1894, both are concurrent development, and the parallel development of these things speaks volumes about the extinguishment of the common man's disenfranchisement and disempowerment over the land resources, and the Britishers' ambitious plan to do roadways, railways, stations, and public utility, dam building, irrigation, and industrial purposes. They have acquired all kind of land, including the chunk of land for the forest purposes. British India's first forest policy, 1894, have been crafted in concurrence with the Land Acquisition Act, and it related to the same spirit of emphasizing resource extraction and economic gain. Therefore, the primary objective was to strengthen state control over the forest and exploit the forest resources to boost imperial revenue, and thus the British administrative oversight in India's forest have maximized their revenue by the Forest Policy 1894 and as well as the Land Acquisition Act of 1894. Thus, we have to see the consolidation of the colonial forest law right from 1855 to 1927, or we can say 1865 to 1927. In both way, the consolidation of the colonial forest law that occurred in 1927, and that is what is called the Indian Forest Act. It introduced some timber duty, transit, regulation of the forest produce. It has created a rule-making power and administrative flexibility, ensuring the longevity of the act. It also tried to have some provincial subject, central control, and as well as the state control. And the preamble of this act emphasized on the consolidation of the forest produce, laws on forest produce with a focus on the revenue generation. So, the forest produce and duties was consolidation of laws on forest produce and duties with a focus on revenue generation is something inbuilt in the preamble of the Forest Act 1927. Despite amendment, the 1927 Act remains operative, reflecting continuity of the colonial governance, and the parameters of the forest policy and law remains the same, and there is no change right from 1855 to 1927. Thus, we see that the India's Forest Act of 1927 has a deep impact of the British rule. It established scientific forest management and systematic tree inventory. It prioritized revenue and control over the ecological and social consideration, and it resulted in mass displacement and alienation of the local forest community. And by way of an assessment and impact of British forest policy, we can say that despite introducing scientific forestry institutional framework and governance structure in the forest management, forest was primarily transformed as a major source of revenue, meaning thereby it has more to do with economy than any kind of an ecology, and then forest administration become a tool of colonial extraction and exploitation and control of the resources and disempowerment of and alienation of the common man and the traditional community. Thus, we see that the forest officer and the forest offenses, if we try to read both the clause together, then we find that despite its scope, it does not define the forest and the forest land, leading to judicial interpretation, and whatever has been consolidated is the duty leviable and the economic concern of the timber and the other forest produce that comes out of the definition and the preambular assertion of the forest. So, we see the objective of the Forest Act 1927 was one hand consolidation of the prior forest law, regulation of produce transit, and revenue generation through imposition and levying of the duties on forest produce. Thus, a 86 section and 13 chapter, which encompasses the broad salient features of this act, is devoted to reserve forests, village forests, protected forests, and then it tries to see that what are the duties, what are the revenue, what are the transit rule, what are the standard transit rule, and then it creates a kind of a bureaucracy of the forest officers to look at the penalties and procedure and clamp the entire system of the revenue generation and levying of the duties and collection of the revenue and the major forest produce and the minor forest produce, including timber and the richness of the forest resources. Thus, we see that how this law, having 86 section and 13 chapter, have consolidated forest management, transit of forest, and revenue through duties, and how the forest categorization of reserve, protected, and village forests have resulted into a perpetual alienation of the local community, and how the tree felling, burning, fire clearing, quarrying, cultivation, grazing, hunting, lopping, and manufacturing activities are prohibited, which was a right, inalienable right of the common people. So, the question of the right was not adjudicated in a very amicable way, and the notification has quashed and extinguish the traditional communities' right under Section 3 to 27, which deals with the reserve forest. And then the penalties which were imposed in that reference is to imprisonment of 2 years and a fine of 20,000. In 1987, this amount was a very exorbitant amount, and that reflects that how stringent and exorbitant fine happens to be empowered under Section 26 and 25, also empowered to stop public and private passage or the water courses through reserve forest. In case of the village forest, that was also taken by the state government, but there was a limited sense of participation and use of the local community. But ultimate the control and command appears to be, whether it is a village forest or protected forest or the reserve forest, the command and control happens to the state. Nonetheless, in village forest, we have certain participation of the local community. So this concept of village forest under Section 28 have paved the way in the independent India as the joint forest management scheme and protected area management scheme in post-independent India. In the category of the forest, protected forest, which was lies under the federal framework to the state, declare any tree or class of tree to be reserved, and it also imposes the same kind of the penalties as is imposed in the case of the reserve forest under Section 30 and 32. Thus, we serve a combined study of the reserve forest, protected forest, and village forest lead to the key provision and administrative power which is given under Section 35 to 38, and this power appears to be very sweeping in its ambit and scope, and it has widened the ambit and scope of the state control, and under the administrative fold and surveillance, the entire forest community and the forest resources was brought under Section 35 to 38. With this, we try to see that how India's forest policy and laws have grew in the colonial context because of the need to fulfill the one requirement was that introduction of railway, which was done in 1853. That's why we see that 1855 the charter have come to some rudimentary law on the forest because the introduction of railway have created demand for the coaches and demand of the coaches and the timber for the railway track. So there was a kind of a pent-up demand for the railway track and the construction of the coaches after the introduction of railway in this country to provide a network of free flow of the goods and services brought from the England and to serve the colonial policy of the drain of wealth. So in that reference, the forest became very important, and that's why we see that there is a corollary between 1855 to 1853, that once railway has created a pent-up demand for the wood and timber, then it was thought that it is only the forest to be commercialized and to be taken under the massive control of the state. The another point which happens to be into the policy is the First World War has created a demand for the shipbuilding industry, and shipbuilding industry requires a lot of timber. So in order to serve the requirement of the shipbuilding industry during the First World War and as well as the introduction of the railway, the Britishers thought that we should have a monopolistic control over the forest resources. That's why if we look at the entire chronology of the development of the forest policies and laws, then we find that there is a kind of a continuum right from 1855 to 1927 in reference to the Forest Act and Land Acquisition Act vis-a-vis the policy of India's forest, which appears to be the colonial in character. So thus forest laws and policy in colonial India is a very important subject to be studied in order to understand very meaningfully and comprehensively the forest laws and policy in independent India, its challenges, its remedies, its vision, and it's kind of a strategy. It is something, a precursor to know the continuum of the forest laws and policy in colonial India. With this, dear learner, I thank and I wish you a happy learning.